The overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in Canada's justice system is a significant and ongoing issue that reflects broader systemic inequalities. Indigenous youth are far more likely to be incarcerated than non Indigenous youth, despite representing a much smaller proportion of the population. In fact, they are about 8 times more likely to be in custody. And although they make up roughly 7% of the youth population, they account for approximately one third of youth in custody. These statistics highlight that this is not an isolated issue, but rather a pattern that points to deeper structural problems within Canadian society and its justice system. To fully understand this issue, it is important to examine the root causes. A key factor is a legacy of colonialism in Canada. Policies such as residential schools and the 60s Scoop had devastating effects on Indigenous communities. These systems forcibly removed children from their families, disrupted cultural practices, and attempted to erase Indigenous identities. As a result, many families experienced long term impacts that continue across generations. This has contributed to what is often referred to as intergenerational trauma. The effects of trauma do not end with one generation. Instead, they can influence parenting, relationships, and overall well being over time. Today, many Indigenous youth experience high rates of mental health challenges, substance use, and family instability. These are not individual failings, but outcomes shaped by historical and structural conditions. In addition to these historical factors, systemic racism continues to play a significant role. Indigenous communities are often overpoliced, and Indigenous youth are more likely to be in contact with law enforcement at an earlier age. Additionally, Indigenous youth are far more likely to be formally charged rather than diverted, which increases their likelihood of deeper involvement in the system. These patterns reflect biases and inequalities embedded within institutions rather than neutral or equal treatment. Looking more closely at the justice system itself, there are several ways it contributes to this overrepresentation. Indigenous youth are more likely to be arrested and processed through formal legal channels. At the same time, they often face barriers that make it more difficult to avoid or exit the system. For example, bail conditions may require stable housing or family support, which is not always accessible due to broader social conditions many Indigenous youth face. There's also a lack of culturally appropriate programs and supports that reflect Indigenous perspectives, values, and approaches to healing. Because of these factors, Indigenous youth are more likely to experience repeated involvement with the justice system, and the effects of this are significant. Incarceration can lead to disconnection from family, community, and culture, which are important sources of identity and support. It can also increase exposure to negative environments and limit future opportunities related to education, employment, and stability. Over time, this contributes to cycles of marginalization and inequality. Youth who experience incarceration at a young age are more likely to face ongoing challenges, which can increase the likelihood of continued system involvement. This demonstrates how the system does not simply respond to social issues, but can also reinforce them. In considering how to move forward, it is clear that meaningful change must address both the system and the broader social conditions that shape it. One important step is expanding culturally relevant and community based programs. These programs can provide alternatives to incarceration, such as diversion initiatives and restorative justice approaches, which focus on healing and accountability rather than punishment. Another key area is increasing community supports. Addressing issues such as housing, education, and access to services can reduce the conditions that contribute to justice system involvement in the first place. It is also essential to address systemic racism within justice institutions, including policing, courts, and corrections, to ensure more equitable treatment. Finally, supporting Indigenous self determination in justice systems is critical. This means recognizing and supporting Indigenous led approaches to justice that are grounded in culture, community, and traditional knowledge. These approaches often emphasize healing, restoration, and relationships, which can lead to more positive outcomes for youth and communities. Overall, the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in Canada's justice system is not the result of individual choices alone. Instead, it reflects a complex interaction of historical, social, and systemic factors. Addressing this issue requires a shift away from punitive approaches and towards solutions that are community based, culturally grounded, and focused on long term change.